If JFK was the optimism of what the 1960s could be, then LBJ was the realism of what it actually was. Does that sentence make sense? I'm sure it will by the end of this episode, hopefully, if I do it right. Remember that the 1960s were insane. There are so many important things happening at the same time throughout this decade that it can get a little confusing. So for today, I want to just focus on our first true Texan president. Eisenhower was born here, but that doesn't really count. Y'all, I'm an Austinite. Like, the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum is a 5-minute drive from my house on the UT campus. On many a weekend road trip, I drive through Johnson City, LBJ's hometown, named not after him, which would have been weird for a young child, but after his 19th century distant cousin. Like, I kind of like LBJ, even though he's very problematic. Yeah, he was problematic, he would be canceled today, and he got us embroiled even further in Vietnam, but he also was the president overseeing the golden age of civil rights and doing his best to support education and eradicate poverty. He's really confusing. For now, let's try to give a short version of LBJ. We've only had 3 Texan presidents, and 2 of them were Bush's, so it's fair that a casual observer might assume that LBJ was similarly conservative. But that casual observer would be wrong. Remember, Johnson is from a different political era. He's a New Deal Democrat through and through. And he rises up through politics as part of the Southern Democrats. You know, the government should create jobs and stay out of segregation. But like a wolf in sheep's clothing, or a liberal in racist clothing, he actually ends up being a true progressive once he takes over the presidency. To understand why, we have to look a bit at his childhood. Johnson was born in 1908. For reference, Teddy Roosevelt was in his last year of the presidency. And he grew up on a struggling farm in the hill country of Texas. His family was mildly influential in local politics, but make no mistake, Johnson was not raised with a silver spoon like Kennedy or the Roosevelts or many other liberal-leaning presidents of the past. His childhood home didn't have electricity or plumbing, but he was really smart. Elected class president his junior year, and he graduated high school at 15. So did MLK, by the way. Johnson attended college at what is now called Texas State University, which is also where I got my master's degree in history, no big deal, where he studied, wait for it, history and education. Oh my God. During his college years, LBJ took time off and spent 9 months teaching Mexican-American children at a poor, segregated school outside of San Antonio. And this school year would be a really important one in his life, as he reminisced later, quote, "I shall never forget the faces of the boys and the girls in that little Welhausen Mexican school. And I remember even yet the pain of realizing and knowing then that college was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor. And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American." LBJ is also the only president in all of American history who ever was a teacher. Okay, so to recap, he grew up in Central Texas, he earned a degree in history at Texas State, and he became radicalized while teaching high school? Am I the ghost of LBJ? In addition to being a struggling farmer and cattle speculator, his dad, Sam Johnson, was also a member of the Texas House of Representatives. He recognized that his son had an exceptional talent for talking, and when he was 23, LBJ was recommended and took a job working for his district's U.S. representative. Importantly, he started working in Congress in 1931, 1 year before FDR's election. He would be right in the middle of the action for the most important Democratic era in U.S. history. The fact that his college years were spent observing the devastating impact of segregation and poverty, and that his young career coincided with FDR's New Deal, meant that LBJ would be a progressive for life. When he was just 27, LBJ was appointed head of the Texas National Youth Administration, so he was now a state administrator of a New Deal program that allowed him to create educational and job opportunities for young Texans. Just 2 years later, he decided to run for Congress himself. So by 1937, at the age of 28, he was representing Austin and the surrounding hill country in the U.S. House of Representatives. And FDR himself quickly identified the young Texan as a really helpful ally for promoting his New Deal in the deep Texas South. Remember those Southern Democrats that JFK will be beholden to? Why do you think Kennedy chose LBJ as his running mate? So LBJ rose through the ranks of politics partly because of his unique position as a white Democrat from the South who could speak the language of Southern Democrats, aka outright racism, while still promoting the policies of Northern liberal leaders like New Yorker FDR and eventually the Massachusetts Kennedys. LBJ seemed to always understand exactly what he needed to do at each step of his career to maximize his power and influence. After being one of the first members of Congress to volunteer for active military duty when World War II broke out, the president sent him as an observer/political ally to be his eyes and ears in the war in the Pacific. Johnson was actually meant to be on a plane that got shot down with no survivors, but he lost his seat at the last minute because he had to use the bathroom. And even the plane he ended up being on experienced a mechanical failure and had to turn around, possibly taking direct fire from the Japanese. Now, the historical record is somewhat murky about whether the plane he was in was actually hit, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. After this incident, Johnson was given the Silver Star Award for coolness. No, I'm not joking. Quote, "The plane in which Lieutenant Commander Johnson was an observer developed mechanical trouble and was forced to turn back alone, presenting a favorable target to the enemy fighters, and he evidenced marked coolness in spite of the hazards involved." Now, considering that Johnson was just an observer and no one else in the plane was given any awards, I'm led to believe that this award was like a political trophy for Johnson to take back with him to DC. Like a kind of thank you from FDR for being one of his biggest supporters. Either way, Johnson was able to run for Senate in 1948 as a World War II veteran and Silver Star recipient. By 1953, he was selected to be the Senate Minority Leader, the most junior senator ever elected to that position. And it's in this position, as Senate Minority, and then, when Democrats win control of the Senate, Majority Leader, that we really start to see the Johnson treatment take shape. Many historians believe that LBJ was the most effective Senate Majority Leader in history. He gathered intelligence. He knew exactly what each senator cared about and what he was prejudiced against. Johnson was ruthless with handshakes and backroom deals to get the votes he needed. He became famous for the Johnson treatment, described here by journalists. Quote, "The treatment could last 10 minutes or 4 hours. It came enveloping its target at the Johnson Ranch swimming pool, in one of Johnson's offices, in the Senate cloakroom, on the floor of the Senate itself. Sometimes it occurred in the bathroom. He moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from his target, his eyes widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics, mimicry, humor, and the genius of analogy made the treatment an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless." Johnson ran for president in 1960, but he was beaten out by Kennedy in the Democratic primary. And Johnson had been very critical of the Kennedys during the campaign, so it was kind of surprising when JFK offered Johnson the VP spot on his ticket, but it paid off. Between JFK's face on television and Johnson's wheeling and dealing behind closed doors, they won the White House in 1960. He was a fairly active vice president, which should surprise no one by now. And other close allies of the president, especially Brother Bobby, pretty openly disliked and or feared LBJ and his crude approach to politics. There were actually rumors that he was going to be dropped from the 1964 ticket, but Kennedy insisted that Johnson would run with him again. Obviously, none of that would matter in the end, because in 1963, JFK was assassinated, and Johnson became the 8th accidental president in American history. LBJ ascending to the presidency in 1963, in my opinion, is one of those watershed moments in American history. With chaos and dissent brewing at home and the Cold War looming abroad, I can't imagine a vice president better situated to just jump into action after the death of Kennedy. Who else would have the congressional connections and insider information, along with the bravado that seems necessary to claim a presidency that no one elected you to? He was uniquely able to draw upon the hope and optimism of Kennedy, coupled with the guilt and trauma of his assassination, to build a democratic domestic agenda that rivaled his hero, FDR's New Deal. So what did Johnson accomplish as president at home? His Great Society domestic programs waged war on poverty, a noble cause, although, as John Green says, do not go to war with a noun, you will always lose. Still, Johnson made good on his experience teaching low-income students in rural Texas. His Economic Opportunity Act included 10 new programs aimed at helping mostly young inner-city Americans. The Neighborhood Youth Corps established work-study programs. The Job Corps helped unemployed 16 to 21-year-olds acquire relevant skills. VISTA was essentially a domestic Peace Corps. Upward Bound offered tutoring to high school students, and the Work Experience program provided daycare and support to poor households. Oh yeah, and in his first year as president, he also signed into law the Civil Rights Act. This landmark legislation formally ended racial segregation and will be followed up 1 year later with the Voting Rights Act. Don't worry, I'm going to talk way more about this legislation next episode. But for now, just remember that without LBJ, a Southerner who knew how to manhandle legislation through Congress, it's kind of hard to imagine many of these sweeping civil rights bills from being passed. Now, Johnson won election in his own right in 1964 in a landslide. And as evidence of how confusing national party politics still was at this point, let's take a quick detour and look for a minute at Johnson's opponent in the 1964 election, a conservative named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was a militant anti-communist who said things like extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. He casually discussed the use of atomic weapons, which just 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis made a lot of Americans nervous, to say the least. LBJ responded brilliantly with a TV campaign ad, a young girl plucking petals from a daisy that ends in a nuclear explosion. Over the mushroom cloud, Johnson says, "These are the stakes, to make a world in which all of God's children can live or go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die." My LBJ is a lot better than my Kennedy. With domestic policy, Goldwater was foreshadowing for a new growing conservative political movement that would fully come to power under Reagan. I mean, speeches made on behalf of Goldwater's 1964 campaign launched Ronald Reagan out of Hollywood and into a political career. Goldwater railed against the federal government overreaching into what he deemed issues for the states and individuals to decide, like Social Security and other New Deal era programs. Also, Jim Crow racism. But similar to our guy LBJ, Goldwater was somewhat complex. For example, he was responsible for desegregating the Senate cafeteria so that his legislative assistant, a Black woman named Catherine Maxwell, could eat alongside other Senate employees. And he did later say that voting against the Civil Rights Act was his greatest regret. Now, in general, he was part of the leave it up to the states contingent of civil rights supporters that, doesn't actually work. And he openly used racism to bring white voters to his side. He was fiscally conservative at a time when, even more so than today, poverty was almost intrinsically linked to race. And his active approach to the Cold War was basically terrifying to most mainstream Republicans. But he was also close friends with Kennedy and was so distraught by his assassination that he struggled to regroup and face Johnson throughout the rest of the campaign. I am not a fan of Barry Goldwater. Understatement of the century. But I think it's another important reminder that people from history are almost always far more interesting and complex than we give them credit for. Nuance, people. Okay, back to LBJ. It was during the campaign of 1964 that LBJ really illuminated his proposed Great Society. In a speech at the University of Michigan, he spoke directly to young people saying, "For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time." Johnson went on to propose a great society in cities, in classrooms, and in the countryside. It's a beautiful speech that's still relevant today. You should go read the whole thing. Now, the main achievements of the Great Society are essentially a continuation and expansion of FDR's New Deal. Johnson's administration created over 60 new programs in just 3 years, including Medicare, health insurance to senior citizens, and Medicaid, health insurance to people below the poverty line. He invested millions of dollars into education and created Project Head Start, a national preschool program for economically disadvantaged children. On the issue of housing, he created the Department of Housing and Urban Development and appointed Robert Weaver, the first Black man to serve in a president's cabinet ever. LBJ's administration passed the Immigration Act of 1965 that finally ended the racist quota systems that gave preference to Northern European, read white, immigrants, truly opening the door to immigrants from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And side note, this was the moment when the Chinese Exclusion Act, from the 1880s, was finally reversed, almost a century later. Of course, we haven't really talked about his crowning domestic achievements yet, civil rights legislation. He signed the Voting Rights Act into law on the same desk that was used by the Supreme Court to hand down the Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson verdicts. If you ever visit the LBJ Museum in Austin, which you should, it's one of my favorites, this desk was one of my favorite items on display, partly because of its historical significance, right? Both enshrining and then tearing down racial segregation. But also because, in true Johnson fashion, he didn't exactly ask for permission before taking it from the White House and putting it in his own museum. LBJ was more of an ask forgiveness, not permission kind of guy. President Johnson's legacy would be incredibly strong if it weren't for one thing. What is it? Oh yeah, that pesky war in Vietnam. To be continued. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe, and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.